This morning's reading from Isaiah might be summarized as moving from bliss to reality, a sentiment that deeply resonated with me this week as I returned from vacation. Isaiah paints a picture of a loving person who prepared a fertile vineyard, clearing it of stones and planting choice vines, and the subsequent disappointment this person experiences that it yielded nothing except wild grapes. As I wrapped up my time away this week, I did one of my favorite things to do. I went to a monastery. That day it was the feast of St. Lawrence. He was the archdeacon under Pope Sixtus II, and in 258, Emperor Valerian ordered that all bishops, priests, and deacons should be put to death, and he started right at the top, executing Pope Sixtus II. The prefect of Rome then summoned St. Lawrence and gave him 3 days to collect all the treasures of the church and to hand them over. So over the next 3 days, St. Lawrence ran from church to church, collecting jewel-encrusted chalices, gold and silver patens, and really anything of significant value. And then he immediately sold them, distributing the money to those in need. Moved with gratitude, people asked how they could ever repay him. St. Lawrence asked them to meet him in the courtyard of the prefect of Rome in 3 days at noon. So after 3 days of running around selling off church property as quickly as he could and distributing the funds to those in need, he arrived at the prefect's palace just as the clock struck noon. With eagerness, the prefect asked St. Lawrence, "What do you have to present to me?" St. Lawrence smiled and said, "Come outside and see for yourself." And there in the courtyard was a sea of people assembled: the blind, the lame, the sick, the widowed, the poor, the hungry, the naked, the homeless. And extending his arms over the assembly, St. Lawrence said to the prefect, "Here are the treasures of the church." A beautiful vineyard. Well, that evening, on the very day the church commemorated St. Lawrence, I got home and saw the headline on Reuters: "Trump vows to evict homeless from Washington. Wild grapes." To move so quickly from bliss to reality, from that beautiful vineyard to wild grapes, it's enough to make you lose your faith. Last week we began the epic treatise on faith found in Hebrews. It's a beautiful crescendo starting with the story of Abraham and Sarah, how they put their faith in God and somehow things turned out well, giving them more descendants than they could ever count, more numerous than the stars in the sky. The crescendo continues this morning, and it almost feels like the grand finale of a fireworks show as we hear all the stories of God's victories. Kingdoms conquered, justice administered, promises obtained, lions' mouths closed, raging fires quenched, the small becoming mighty in war, and armies scattered. A beautiful vineyard. But then Paul goes on, not to tell us stories of victory, but to tell us stories of hardship, stories of mocking, flogging, imprisonment, getting stoned to death, being sawn into two, being persecuted and tormented. Wild grapes. How does Paul make sense of this all, this swirling convection of bliss and tragedy? He offers us two ways. First, by the telling of stories that lift our hearts and fill them with hope, we can share faith. And by also telling that even though things don't always seem to work out well in this world, God always promises to provide something better in the world to come. And in these past few days, I saw that all at work. This week, a parishioner rushed home to see her mom, who started hospice care. Wild grapes. Later in the week, we got an update. Her mom was eating again and was up and about. They even spent the morning listening to Episcopal hymns on Spotify, pausing between each hymn to have a beautiful reflection with each other on what each hymn meant to them. A beautiful vineyard. I bumped into someone at a shop who had a tumor growing on her spine and shared how she was in immense pain. Wild grapes. But with all the peace in the world and with all the faith that could fill one's heart, she said, but in a few months, I'll be in a place where there will be no more crying and no more pain. A beautiful vineyard. And that wild grape of an edict that the president made earlier this week notwithstanding, St. James did what we do best week after week. We turned our courtyard and parish hall into a beautiful vineyard where the treasures of the church were loved and fed Tuesday, Friday, and Saturday. Paul's point in Hebrews: we're living in a beautiful vineyard with wild grapes. But here's the good news: God can work with both. But even more so, Paul wants us to tell all our stories of God's greatness, how we saw God's love at work in our lives. Because with every story told, the cloud of witnesses gets bigger and bigger, accumulating more accounts of God's love. It expands to engulf the sky with each narrative on how someone found God's peace. So sing that song, the love song, my beloveds, about this beautiful vineyard we find ourselves in, and watch that great cloud of witnesses grow. There's enough stories about wild grapes out there, but your story concerning this beautiful vineyard and all the glorious works of God you saw might just be the story that gives someone faith. It might just be the story that unfolds someone into the great cloud of witnesses ceaselessly singing that endless song, that celestial song sung by angels and archangels, that song of God's ceaseless and unfailing love.